You think you know them? Everyone thinks they know them. The horned helmets, the dragon ships, the screaming warriors descending on a monastery at dawn, torches in hand, leaving nothing behind but ash and silence. This image is everywhere, in films, in television, in the names of sports teams and the logos of energy drinks and the tattoos on the arms of people who have never been north of Manchester. It is also, in almost every important detail, wrong. The horned helmets were never worn by Viking warriors. That image was invented by a 19th century costume designer for a Swedish opera, and it has proved almost impossible to kill. The dragon ships existed, they were real and extraordinary, but they were used by a small minority of the Norse population for a fraction of their lives. And the screaming, burning warrior at the monastery gate? He existed too, but he went home afterward. And home is where this story begins. Because the overwhelming majority of the people we call Vikings, the millions of men, women, and children who lived in Scandinavia between the 8th and 11th centuries of the Common Era, never raided anything. They never boarded a longship. They never saw England or Ireland or the shores of the Mediterranean. They woke up in the morning in a low-ceilinged house, full of wood smoke and the smell of animals, and they went to work. They fed their cattle, they repaired their fishing nets, they spun wool and baked bread, and negotiated disputes with their neighbors at the local assembly. They fell in love, raised children, argued about land boundaries, mourned their dead, told stories in the firelight and grew old. They were farmers, craftsmen, merchants, mothers, grandmothers. They were human beings living human lives in one of the most extraordinary societies the medieval world produced. A society whose sophistication, whose legal complexity, whose treatment of women, whose commercial reach, and whose cultural richness, the popular image of the blood-soaked berserker has almost entirely obscured. This is the story of the Vikings at home, not the warriors, the people, not the raid, the life. To understand the Norse people, to understand why they were who they were, why they built the society they built, why they went where they went, you must first understand the land that produced them. And the land is not gentle. Scandinavia in the Viking Age was a landscape of extremes. Norway's coastline is one of the most dramatic in the world. 1,000 kilometers of fjords cutting deep into the mountains, the sea reaching far inland through narrow channels flanked by rock faces that rise hundreds of meters from the water's edge. The mountains behind the fjords are not modest hills. They are serious mountains, snow-capped for 8 months of the year, their passes closed by winter, their flanks too steep and too thin-soiled for cultivation. The habitable land in Norway was the narrow strips at the edges, the valley floors, the coastal margins, the patches of relatively flat ground where a family could build a farmhouse and grow enough to survive. These strips were small and isolated from each other. The mountains and the fjords that made Norway beautiful also made it a landscape of disconnected communities, each living in its own enclosed world, connected to the others primarily by the sea. This is the key to understanding the Norse relationship with the ocean. For most peoples in the ancient and medieval world, the sea was a barrier, a dangerous, unpredictable obstacle that separated communities from each other and had to be crossed with great difficulty and greater risk. For the Norse people of Norway, the sea was the opposite. It was the road. The easiest way to travel from one Norwegian fjord community to another was not to cross the mountains, which was often impossible, but to sail along the coast. The sea was not the enemy, it was the highway. Sweden presented a different geography, vast forests, enormous lakes, the great river systems that drained southward toward the Baltic. The Swedish landscape was more accessible than Norway's, but in its own way demanding. The forests were dense enough to be genuinely trackless, the winters were long and severe, and the agricultural potential of much of the terrain was limited by the thin, acidic soils of the boreal zone. But Sweden's river systems, the great rivers flowing from the interior to the Baltic coast, provided something Norway lacked: access to the east. The Swedes, following these rivers, would eventually reach the great waterways of what is now Russia and Ukraine, opening trade routes that extended all the way to Constantinople and the Arab world. Denmark was the most hospitable of the three. The Jutland Peninsula and the Danish islands offered the best agricultural land in Scandinavia, relatively flat, with manageable soils, a climate moderated by the surrounding seas. The Danes were the most agricultural of the Norse peoples, the most settled, and in many ways the most connected to the broader European world of the early medieval period. Three distinct geographies, three distinct ways of engaging with the world, but a shared culture, a shared language, Old Norse, the common tongue that linked Norway, Sweden, and Denmark in a single cultural world, however politically fragmented. Shared religious traditions, shared legal concepts, shared artistic sensibilities, shared stories, and above all, a shared relationship with the sea that no purely continental people could entirely understand. The climate of the Viking Age deserves attention because it shaped everything. The period from roughly 800 to 1100 CE, the heart of the Viking Age, coincided with what climate historians call the medieval warm period, a phase of relative climatic warmth that made Scandinavian agriculture somewhat more productive than it had been in the preceding centuries and would be in the centuries that followed. This warmth, a degree or two above the long-term average, modest by the standards of modern climate change but significant by the standards of subsistence agriculture, made marginal land productive. It extended the growing season. It made the sea crossings of the North Atlantic to Iceland, to Greenland, eventually to North America, less lethal than they would otherwise have been. The Viking Age was in part a product of a favorable climate. The population of Scandinavia grew, the agricultural base expanded, the surplus that made trade and craft specialization possible increased, and the pressure of a growing population on a limited supply of good agricultural land, particularly in Norway, where the habitable strips were always small, pushed people outward, toward the sea, toward the horizon, toward the places that the Norse sagas would describe with the particular mixture of wonder and matter-of-factness that characterizes Norse literary style. Beyond the sea, there is land. We went and looked. Here is what we found. If you want to understand how the Norse people actually lived, not how they fought, not how they sailed, but how they spent the hours of an ordinary day, start with the building they called home, the longhouse. The name is descriptive and accurate. These were long buildings, typically between 15 and 45 meters in length, sometimes longer, rectangular in plan, their long axis oriented to minimize exposure to the prevailing wind. They were the most common domestic structure in the Norse world, from the farms of Iceland to the villages of Denmark, from the Norwegian fjords to the Norse settlements in the British Isles. But saying longhouse is like saying house. The word covers an enormous range of structures, from the modest single-room dwellings of ordinary farmers to the great hall complexes of powerful chieftains that were the social, political, and economic centers of their communities. What they shared was a basic structural logic. The walls were constructed from whatever material the local landscape provided. In Norway and Sweden, where timber was abundant, the walls were built from logs or from vertical planks. In Iceland and the Scottish Islands, where wood was scarce and had to be imported at great expense, the walls were built from turf, great blocks of peat cut from the ground, stacked in double courses with a rubble fill between them, creating walls of extraordinary thickness that provided insulation against the North Atlantic cold. The roofs were typically thatched with straw, with reeds, with heather, depending on what was available, or covered with turf, which provided excellent insulation and could support a covering of living grass that gave the buildings an almost organic quality, as if they were growing from the earth rather than built upon it. Inside, the basic plan was usually the same: a single, large space, occasionally subdivided by light partitions, organized around a central hearth fire. This fire was the heart of the longhouse in every sense. It provided heat in winters that could be genuinely life-threatening. It provided light, the only artificial light available in a world without electricity, candles being expensive and reserved for particular circumstances. It provided the means of cooking, and it provided the social center of the household, the place around which the family gathered in the evenings, where food was prepared and eaten, where stories were told, where the business of the household was discussed. The smoke from the hearth fire rose toward the roof and escaped through a smoke hole, or in later, more elaborate longhouses through a dedicated smoke vent. But it did not escape entirely. Anyone who has spent time in a room with an open fire knows that smoke tends to linger. In a longhouse with no windows and a smoke hole that was necessarily small to prevent rain and cold from entering, the interior atmosphere was perpetually hazy. The Norse people lived their lives in wood smoke. Their clothes smelled of it. Their hair smelled of it. Their food was partially smoked as a byproduct of being cooked over an open fire. The distinctive preservation quality of smoke, its antibacterial properties, its ability to slow the spoilage of food, was something the Norse understood empirically, even if they could not have explained the microbiology. Along the long walls of the longhouse ran raised platforms, benches essentially, constructed from timber elevated above the earth floor by perhaps 30 to 40 centimeters. These served multiple purposes. During the day, they were work surfaces, where the women of the household would sit to spin wool, where children would sit to help with tasks, where craftsmen would work on small projects. In the evening, they were dining surfaces. The household ate, seated on these platforms, using them as benches around the low fire. At night, they were beds. The Norse people slept on these platforms on mattresses of straw or heather, covered with wool or linen, under blankets of wool and furs. The entire household slept in the same space, parents and children, and perhaps elderly grandparents and servants, all in the same room, their body heat contributing to the warmth that the fire provided. Privacy in the modern sense did not exist. This is not a judgment, it is simply a fact about how people lived before the concept of separate rooms for separate activities and separate people became normal. The longhouse was a shared space, and the social norms that governed behavior within it, the understood rules about when to speak and when to be quiet, about the boundaries of personal space in a situation where personal space was physically impossible, were part of the education of every Norse child. The great longhouses of the chieftains and jarl, so the social and political elite of Norse society, it was something beyond the ordinary. The chieftain's hall was not just a dwelling, it was an institution. It was the place where the chieftain hosted the feasts that cemented his political relationships, where he fed his followers, his allies, his clients, demonstrating through generosity the wealth and power that justified his authority. It was the place where disputes were heard and judgments rendered. It was the place where important decisions about the community were made. It was the place where travelers and merchants stopped, where news from distant places was heard, where the social and commercial life of the community concentrated. The Great Hall at Borg i Lofoten, excavated on the Norwegian island of Lofoten, gives the best sense of what these chieftain halls could be. It is the largest known longhouse in Norway. Nearly 83 meters from end to end, its floor area equivalent to a substantial modern house. Its construction required the organized labor of many people over an extended period. Its maintenance required continuous investment. This was a statement, a political statement built in timber and turf and thatch. I am powerful enough to build and maintain this. Come, and I will feed you. Come, and I will protect you. Come, and you will know where power lives in this community. The life of a Norse farming family was organized, above everything else, by the agricultural calendar, not the calendar of dates and months. The Norse calendar was complex and somewhat variable, tied to observation of the sun and the behavior of the natural world rather than to fixed astronomical calculations. But the underlying rhythm was universal. The year had a cold half and a warm half, and everything depended on what you did with each. Spring was the season of hope and of frantic activity. As the snow retreated from the fields and the ground thawed enough to be worked, the farming households of Scandinavia shifted into a mode of intense labor. The animals that had been kept alive through the winter, fed on the stored hay, huddled in the animal section of the longhouse, whose body heat helped warm the human section, were brought out into the thin spring sunshine. The fields were ploughed and planted. The crops were modest by modern standards, calibrated to the specific conditions of Scandinavian agriculture. Barley was the most important grain, hardier than wheat, tolerant of the cooler conditions and shorter growing seasons of northern Europe. Oats were also grown, particularly in Scotland and Iceland, rye in some areas, small quantities of wheat where the climate permitted. Alongside the grain crops, the Norse grew vegetables, cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans. These were not luxuries, but staples, essential sources of nutrition in a diet that would otherwise have been dangerously monotonous. The animals were central to everything. Cattle provided milk, processed into butter and cheese for storage, consumed fresh in the summer months, and eventually meat. Cattle were wealth on the hoof, the most significant capital asset of a Norse farming family. The number of cattle a family owned was a measure of its prosperity and its status. Sheep provided wool, the most important textile fiber of the Norse world, the raw material from which virtually all clothing was made, and milk and meat. In Iceland, where cattle were more difficult to maintain through the severe winters, sheep were the dominant livestock. Pigs provided meat. Pork, cured and smoked, was an important protein source through the winter. Goats were kept in the more marginal agricultural areas, particularly in Norway, where their ability to survive on vegetation that cattle and sheep could not eat made them valuable in the rocky terrain of the fjord farms. And horses. Norse horses were not the massive destriers of medieval knights. They were smaller animals, more similar to modern ponies, bred for the conditions of Scandinavian terrain. They provided transport, they provided agricultural labor, pulling the plough, carrying loads, and eventually, when they were old, they provided meat. Horse meat was a normal part of the Norse diet. When Christianity came to Scandinavia, one of the early points of conflict between the new religion and the old customs was the Christian prohibition on eating horse. The Norse regarded this prohibition with genuine puzzlement, hence the long winter that was always coming. Fish were caught in enormous quantities. The Norse were extraordinary fishermen. The North Sea and the North Atlantic were among the richest fishing grounds in the world, and the Norse developed the techniques and the equipment to exploit them. Cod, herring, and a variety of other species were caught, then dried or salted or smoked to preserve them. The technique of stockfish, cod hung on wooden racks in the cold, dry air of the Norwegian coastal winter, dried until it was hard as wood and could be stored for years without spoilage, was a Norse innovation that would eventually become one of the most important preserved foods in the medieval European economy. Stockfish from Norway fed people across northern Europe for centuries. Hay was cut and dried for the animals. Berries were gathered from the forests and preserved. Root vegetables were stored in cool, dark cellars. The smoking and salting of meat and fish continued through the summer and into the autumn. Autumn was the season of slaughter. In October and November, as the grazing season ended and the cost of feeding animals through the winter began to exceed the value of keeping them alive, the Norse households made the hard calculation of which animals would survive until spring and which would not. The animals that would not survive, the old, the weak, the surplus cattle and sheep that the winter's hay supply could not sustain, were killed and their meat preserved, smoked, salted, dried, stored in whatever form would keep it edible through the months of cold. This autumn's slaughter was both a necessity and an occasion. The blood from the slaughtered animals was used to make blood sausage. The fat was rendered and preserved, nothing was wasted, and the fresh meat that was available in the immediate aftermath of the slaughter, before preservation was complete, was the occasion for feasting, for hospitality, for the communal eating that strengthened the social bonds between neighboring families. Winter was the season of endurance and of culture. The farming work of the summer and autumn was finished. The animals were in their quarters. The stores of food, the dried fish, the smoked meat, the preserved butter and cheese, the grain, would either see the household through until spring, or they would not. In the long winter evenings gathered around the hearth fire in the smoky warmth of the longhouse, the Norse people told stories, and the stories they told were extraordinary. One of the most striking and least discussed aspects of Norse civilization is the sophistication of its legal culture. The popular image of the Viking is a figure who operates outside law, who takes what he wants by force, who recognizes no authority but his own strength. This image is false in almost every particular. Norse society was, in fact, intensely legal. The institution at the heart of this legal culture was the Thing, the assembly. The Thing was not a court in the modern sense. It was a meeting, an outdoor gathering of the free men of a community or region held at regular intervals, at which legal disputes were heard, laws were made and promulgated, and community decisions were reached. Every free man had the right to attend the Thing. Every free man had the right to speak. The Thing was not a place where a king or a chieftain handed down decisions from a position of authority. It was a deliberative assembly, a forum for community governance, whose decisions derived their validity from the collective agreement of those present. The Althing of Iceland, established in 930 CE at Thingvellir, a dramatic natural amphitheatre of volcanic rock in the southwest of the island, is the most famous of the Norse assemblies. It met for 2 weeks every summer, drawing free men from across the island, and it was the governing institution of a society that had, in founding Iceland, created a polity without a king. Iceland in the Viking Age had no central executive authority. No king, no standing army, no police force. What it had was the Althing, the law, and the willingness of free men to enforce legal decisions through the mechanisms of social pressure, compensation, and ultimately, outlawry. Outlawry was the most severe legal sanction available. The declaration that a person was outside the law, that any person might kill them without legal consequence, that they had no rights and no protection. An outlaw was expelled from the community in the most complete sense possible, stripped of all the protections that membership in a lawful community provided. It was a sanction that worked because membership in the community was so valuable. To lose it, to be declared a wolf in the forest beyond the reach of law and beyond its protection, was a punishment severe enough to deter all but the most desperate or the most powerful. The Norse legal system was not perfect. Power mattered. A wealthy and well-connected man could secure legal outcomes, that a poor and friendless man could not. Chieftains could use their influence at the Thing to favor their allies and disadvantage their enemies. The law was applied by the community, and the community had its own politics. But the existence of the Thing, the principle that free men assembled together could make and apply law, that disputes should be resolved by argument and evidence and community judgment rather than by pure force, was a genuine institutional achievement. It created a framework of rights and obligations that constrained even the powerful and provided ordinary people with mechanisms for seeking redress. The Norse legal vocabulary was enormously rich. There were laws governing land tenure, who could own land, how it could be transferred, what obligations landowners had to their neighbors, laws governing inheritance, how property passed between generations, what share went to sons, what share to daughters, what to widows, laws governing marriage, what constituted a valid marriage, what grounds existed for divorce, what happened to property when a marriage ended, laws governing violence, the scale of compensation owed for injuries of various kinds, the distinction between killings that were legally defensible and those that were murder, the procedures for declaring blood feud, and the mechanisms for ending it. The vergild, the man price, the compensation payment owed when a free person was killed, was a fundamental concept of Norse, and more broadly Germanic, law. Every free person had a vergild, a monetary value that their life was worth in legal terms. Kill a man, and his family was owed his vergild. Pay the vergild, and the killing was legally resolved. Refuse to pay, and the family was entitled to pursue a blood feud. This system, compensation rather than punishment as the primary legal response to violence, seems strange to modern eyes, but it had a logic. It provided a mechanism for resolving the violent disputes that were otherwise self-perpetuating, feuds that could continue for generations, each killing generating the right to a retaliatory killing in a cycle that destroyed communities. The vergild said, "There is a price, pay it, end the cycle." Of all the ways in which the reality of Norse society differs from the popular image, perhaps none is more striking than the position of women. The image of the Viking world is aggressively masculine, all warriors and drinking halls and competitive feats of strength. Women appear in this image primarily as victims, the terrified inhabitants of raided monasteries, the captives carried off as slaves. The reality is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. Norse women held a legal status that was, by the standards of the medieval world, remarkable. A Norse woman could own property in her own name. She could inherit land and goods from her parents, and she retained ownership of her property after marriage. It did not automatically pass to her husband, as it did in many other European legal traditions. She could manage her own financial affairs, enter into contracts, and represent herself in legal disputes. She could divorce her husband. This is worth pausing on. In most of medieval Europe, marriage was dissoluble only in exceptional circumstances, and the grounds for dissolution heavily favored men. In the Norse world, a woman who wished to end her marriage had legal avenues to do so. She could declare the divorce before witnesses, stating her grounds. She was entitled to the return of her dowry and her bride price. The grounds for divorce in Norse law were specific and practical. A husband who failed to maintain his wife and household. A husband who struck his wife. Norse law distinguished between violence that crossed a legal threshold and that which did not. A husband who wore women's clothing, an interesting provision that reflects Norse concerns about gender norms and the social categories they policed. The woman's property, the dowry provided by her father and the bride price paid by her husband, remained legally hers throughout the marriage and was returned to her if it ended. She was not economically dependent on her husband's goodwill in the way that women in many other medieval legal systems were. The Norse woman was also, in many practical senses, the manager of the household economy. When a Norse man was away, raiding, trading, fishing, attending the thing, visiting neighbors, the woman of the household was in charge. This was not a reluctant concession to necessity. It was the understood and legally recognized reality of how Norse households functioned. The woman held the household keys, literally the keys to the locked storage where the valuable goods were kept, as a symbol of her authority over the domestic economy. She managed the food stores, she directed the labor of the household servants and slaves, she made the decisions that kept the farm functioning, she handled the commercial transactions, buying and selling in local markets that the household's economy required. This was not merely domestic management, it was economic agency. It was the exercise of real authority over real resources. Archaeological evidence has added important dimensions to what the literary sources tell us about Norse women's lives. The Oseberg ship burial, one of the most spectacular Viking Age archaeological finds excavated in Norway in 1904, contained the remains of two women. One was older, perhaps in her 70s or 80s. One was younger, perhaps in her 50s. Both were buried with extraordinary richness. The ship itself was magnificent, a fully fitted-out longship, some 22 meters long, buried in a clay mound. With the two women were buried household goods of extraordinary quality, carved wooden furniture, textiles of remarkable fineness, kitchen equipment, agricultural tools, a wagon decorated with intricate carvings, sledges, horses. The richness of the burial speaks to the status of the women interred in it. These were not minor figures in their society. They were people of importance, commemorated with a burial that required enormous resources to execute, and that preserved in the clay of the Norwegian coastline a snapshot of what high-status Norse women owned and controlled. Recent DNA evidence from Norse Age burials across the British Isles and Iceland has added another dimension. A significant proportion of the individuals identified as having Scandinavian genetic ancestry in these populations are female. Women traveled with the Norse expansion not just as captured slaves, though that certainly happened, but as active participants in the settlement of new territories. The founding of Norse communities in Iceland, in the Faroe Islands, in the Scottish Islands, in parts of Ireland and England. These were not all male military enterprises followed later by families. They were, at least in part, migrations of families from the beginning. Women were there, at the founding, in the ships. The Norse world was not a simple agrarian economy where everyone grew food and nothing else. It was a sophisticated commercial civilization with extensive craft specialization, active long-distance trade, and the kind of monetary economy that only developed societies sustain. Craft production in the Norse world operated at multiple levels. At the household level, virtually every Norse family produced goods for its own use. Women spun wool into thread and wove thread into cloth. Men worked with wood, making furniture, tools, vessels, the 1,000 wooden objects that a pre-industrial household required. Both worked with leather, cutting and stitching shoes, bags, harnesses, the practical items that constant use destroyed and constant production replenished. This was not specialized craft production, it was the baseline competence of a self-sufficient household. Every Norse adult possessed these skills. They were as fundamental as knowing how to cook or how to plant a field. Above this household production level were the specialist craftsmen, people who had developed skills in particular crafts to a level that exceeded household competence and who produced goods for trade and sale rather than primarily for household use. Blacksmiths were among the most important and most respected of these specialists. Iron production in the Norse world was complex. It required the smelting of iron ore in purpose-built furnaces, the management of charcoal production, and the skilled working of hot iron into useful forms. A good blacksmith could make tools and agricultural equipment, knives and weapons, nails and fittings, and the thousands of small iron objects that a functioning society required. The smith's craft carried a particular cultural weight in the Norse world. The mythological smith was Völundr, a figure of supernatural skill and terrible power, whose story in the Norse poetic tradition combines mastery of craft with themes of captivity and revenge. The smith stood apart from ordinary society, valued for skills that ordinary people could not replicate, associated in the cultural imagination with forces that were both creative and dangerous. Jewelers and metalworkers in precious metals occupied a prestigious position. The Norse produced jewelry of extraordinary quality. The characteristic tortoise brooches that Norse women wore to fasten their apron dresses at the shoulders, the elaborate penannular brooches of the Irish and Scottish Norse tradition, arm rings and neck rings of twisted silver, the delicate filigree work and granulation that characterized the finest Norse metalworking. These objects were not merely decorative, they were wealth. Silver in the Norse world functioned as money, not in the form of coins initially, but in the form of hack silver, pieces of silver objects cut to the required weight, used in transactions that were measured by the weighing of metal rather than the counting of coins. A Norse merchant or trader would carry a balance scale, a simple beam balance with weights on one side and the silver being measured on the other. The value of a transaction was determined by how much silver it required, weighed against standard weights. The silver could be anything: arm rings cut into pieces, foreign coins, ingots, fragments of silver vessels. What mattered was the weight. This was a completely different monetary culture from the coin-based economies of the Byzantine world or the Carolingian West. But it was a monetary culture. It involved measurement, standardization, and the mutual trust required for commercial exchange. The trade routes that Norse merchants traveled were among the most extensive in the medieval world. The western routes, to England, to Ireland, to the Frankish coast, to the Iberian Peninsula and beyond, were the routes that brought the Norse into the most direct and violent contact with the rest of Europe. They were also, more significantly in terms of volume, the routes of commercial exchange. English silver, abundant, well-produced and trusted, was one of the most sought-after commodities in the Norse world. Frankish wine travelled northward, Norse furs and amber and slaves travelled southward and eastward. The eastern routes, through the Baltic, up the rivers of what is now Russia, over the portages between river systems, and down to the Black Sea and the Caspian, connected the Norse world to the Byzantine Empire and to the Islamic Caliphate. These were the routes travelled by the Varangians, the name that the Eastern sources used for the Scandinavian traders and mercenaries who appeared along the Russian river systems from the 9th century onward. The word Rus, from which the name Russia ultimately derives, may itself be of Scandinavian origin, referring to the Norse peoples who travelled these routes. The trade goods that moved along these eastern routes were extraordinary in their variety and their geographic origin. Norse merchants brought furs, the skins of the beaver, the squirrel, the sable, the ermine, southward toward the Byzantine and Arab markets that valued them enormously. They brought amber from the Baltic coast, they brought walrus ivory from the Arctic hunting grounds, they brought slaves, captured in raids across northern Europe, traded southward through the Arab and Byzantine markets. In exchange, they received silver, Islamic silver dirhams, minted in the cities of the Caliphate and flowing northward through the trade networks in quantities that have left their mark in the archaeological record. The hordes of Arabic coins found across Scandinavia and the British Isles, the thousands of individual dirhams that archaeologists have recovered from Norse Age sites from Dublin to the Russian steppe. They received silks from Constantinople and the East, the prestigious luxury textile that the Norse elite valued as a marker of status: spices, glassware, the sophisticated manufactured goods of civilizations that had been producing them for centuries. The Norse were not peripheral participants in the medieval world economy. They were central to it. Before the cross came to Scandinavia, the Norse people inhabited a religious world of extraordinary richness and complexity. It was not an organized religion in the institutional sense that Christianity or Islam are organized religions. There were no churches, no professional clergy in the formal sense, no sacred texts. The religious life of the Norse people was embedded in the ordinary fabric of existence, in the agricultural calendar, in the social customs of feasting and gift-giving, in the stories told around the fire, in the specific sacred places of the landscape. The gods were real presences in the Norse world, not theological abstractions, not distant creators who had set the universe in motion and withdrawn, but active, interested, sometimes capricious beings whose favor was worth seeking and whose displeasure was worth avoiding. Odin was the most complex and the most troubling of the Norse gods. He was the All-Father, the god who had hung for 9 days on the world tree Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, sacrificing himself to gain the knowledge of the runes, the magical writing system that was also a system of cosmic order. He was the god of wisdom, but the wisdom he possessed was the wisdom of one who had paid terrible costs for it. He had given up one eye to drink from the well of knowledge. He was the god of the dead, specifically of the warrior dead, whose spirits were brought to Valhalla by the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, to feast and fight until the end of the world. He was the god of poetry, of magic, of the dangerous knowledge that lay at the edges of the humanly comprehensible. The Norse did not simply venerate Odin, they were also somewhat afraid of him. He was unreliable, treacherous by divine design. He changed his favors, he led those he loved to their deaths, because their deaths were what he needed to fill the halls of Valhalla for the final battle. Odin was not a comfortable god to worship. Thor was more reassuring. The thunder god, the hammer wielder, the defender of the worlds of gods and men against the giants who perpetually threatened to overwhelm them. Thor was the deity of the ordinary Norse farmer in a way that the aristocratic, dangerous Odin was not. Thor was powerful and honest and not overly subtle. He solved problems by hitting them. He was the patron of oaths, of honesty, of the straightforward virtues that ordinary people valued. The popularity of Mjolnir pendants, miniature hammers worn as amulets representing Thor's weapon, across the Norse world speaks to the genuine affection the ordinary Norse people felt for this god. When Christianity came and the cross became the standard Christian symbol, the Norse response was, in part, to deliberately adopt the hammer as a counter-symbol, a marker of the old faith against the new. Freya and Freya, brother and sister, the divine twins of the Vanir family of gods, governed the aspects of existence closest to ordinary human life. Freya was the god of fertility, of good harvests, of prosperity, the god most directly relevant to the agricultural survival of a farming community. Freya was the goddess of love, of beauty, of the desire that connects people, and of the magic called Seder, a form of shamanic practice associated with women and with the liminal transgressive knowledge that shamanic traditions often traffic in. The sacred landscape of the Norse world was not confined to formal cult sites. Certain trees were sacred, great ash trees, sacred groves where offerings were left, and where the boundary between the human world and the divine was thin. Certain springs were sacred, places where the water that emerged from the earth carried the quality of the otherworldly. Certain rocks were sacred, formations that bore some resemblance to human faces, to which offerings were made, the household gods. The Disir, the female ancestral spirits, and the Landvetir, the spirits of the land, were as real and as important to ordinary Norse people as the great gods of the cosmological pantheon. These were the beings who needed to be kept happy, who needed to receive their offerings, whose goodwill was the difference between a good harvest and a bad one, between a healthy household and a sick one. The great cosmological drama, like the world tree Yggdrasil, the 9 realms, the great serpent Nidhugger gnawing at the tree's roots, the coming end of the world in Ragnarok. This was the grand backdrop against which ordinary religious life was lived. But ordinary religious life was not primarily about cosmic drama. It was about the practical, immediate concern of keeping the sacred powers of the local world in a state of benign relationship with the human community. The Norse people thought about death in ways that were distinctive and, in some respects, surprising. They did not in general fear death in the existential way that many later religious traditions have encouraged. Death was a fact, as inevitable as winter, as natural as the turning of the year. The question was not whether it would come, but how one met it and what happened afterward. The Norse afterlife was not singular. There were multiple destinations for the dead, depending on how they had lived and how they had died. Valhalla, is the most famous. The Hall of Odin, where the warrior dead feasted and trained for the final battle of Ragnarok. The Valkyries chose the slain warriors on the battlefield and brought the most heroic to this hall. But Valhalla was not for everyone. Most of the dead went to hell, not the Christian hell, but the realm of the dead goddess Hel, a cold, dark place that was the destination of those who died in their beds, of illness or old age rather than in battle. Hell was not punishment, it was simply where most people ended up. There was also Folkvanga, the field of Freya, where half of the warrior dead went, the other half from Odin's share. There was Rand's Hall at the bottom of the sea, where those who drowned were received. The burial practices of the Norse world were correspondingly diverse. Cremation was common, particularly in the earlier periods of the Viking Age in Scandinavia itself. The body was burned on a pyre, sometimes with grave goods, sometimes with the sacrificed animals, and occasionally humans who would accompany the dead into the afterlife. The ashes might be placed in a vessel and buried, or scattered. Inhumation, burial of the intact body, and was also practiced and becomes more common through the Viking Age, possibly reflecting Christian influence even before formal conversion. The ship burial is the practice most closely associated with the Norse in the popular imagination, and it was real, though reserved for the most elite burials. The body was placed in a ship, surrounded by grave goods of extraordinary richness, and the ship was either buried in a mound or, in some cases, pushed out to sea and set alight. The Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials, the two most intact examples of this practice, both excavated in Norway, give an extraordinary glimpse of what these burials involved. The ships themselves were real, seaworthy vessels. The grave goods included not just weapons and jewelry, but the full material equipment of a high-status Norse household: beds, kitchen equipment, textiles, animals, food. These were burials designed to provide for the dead in whatever came after death, to send them into the next life with everything they needed, just as the house they had lived in this life had contained everything they needed here. The care and expense invested in these burials, the labor of building the mound, the sacrifice of valuable animals and goods, the social organization required to carry out the ceremony, speak to the genuine belief that what happened after death mattered, that the dead continued to exist in some meaningful sense, and that their well-being in that existence was affected by the quality of the preparation. The Norse people did not only live interesting lives, they told interesting stories about those lives. The sagas, the long prose narratives of the Norse literary tradition, are one of the great achievements of medieval literature and one of the least appreciated outside the Scandinavian world. They were written down primarily in Iceland between the 12th and 14th centuries, but they record stories and traditions that in many cases reach back to the Viking Age itself. They are written in a style that is immediately distinctive, flat, understated, precise, with a dry, ironic distance from their subject matter that makes the violence and passion they describe all the more powerful. A character in a saga does not emote. He acts, he speaks briefly, he dies, usually with a memorable last line. The narrator describes what happened without telling you how to feel about it. The reader, or listener, is left to do the emotional work. This is not primitive storytelling, it is a sophisticated literary technique, and it produces effects that more explicit emotional prose cannot achieve. The sagas are not all of one kind. The family sagas, the Íslendinga Sögur, are the stories of Icelandic families in the period of the settlement and the first century or two of the Althing. They deal with disputes over land and honor, with blood feuds and their resolutions, with the complex web of loyalty and obligation that governed Norse social life. They are, in a certain sense, realistic fiction. Stories about recognizable human beings in recognizable social situations, doing things that are comprehensible and often sympathetic, even when they are violent. Njál Saga is perhaps the greatest of them. The long, complex story of a blood feud in 10th century Iceland, centered on the wise and far-seeing Njál and his friendship with the warrior Gunnar. It builds toward a tragedy that is felt as inevitable from early in the narrative, the outcome of a system of honor and obligation that constrains every character, even as it destroys them. The king's sagas, the Konunga Sögur, tell the stories of the Norwegian and Danish kings. Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, a history of the Norwegian kings from legendary times to the late 12th century, is the most important of these, a work of considerable historiographical sophistication that blends mythological material with genuine historical tradition. The legendary sagas, the Fornaldar Sögur, reach back into a mythological past, telling stories of heroes and monsters and the great figures of Norse tradition. The story of Sigurda and the dragon Fafnir, the Norse version of the dragon slayer myth that appears in modified form in the Nibelungenlied and that may be the ultimate ancestor of Tolkien's Smaug, belongs to this tradition. These stories were not just entertainment. They were the medium through which Norse culture transmitted its values, its history, its understanding of what human life was and how it should be lived. The sagas taught their audiences what courage looked like, what loyalty required, what the proper response to an insult was, and what the proper response to a generous deed was. They modeled behavior, not by moralizing, which the Norse literary tradition resisted as aggressively as it resisted emotional display, but by showing, this is what happened, this is what people did, draw your own conclusions. The transformation of Scandinavia from the old Norse religion to Christianity was not a simple or a sudden process. It took roughly 2 centuries, from the late 9th century, when Norse rulers in the British Isles first began to convert, to the early 12th century, when organized Christianity was firmly established across all 3 Scandinavian kingdoms, and it proceeded differently in different places at different speeds, with different degrees of violence and of accommodation. The catalyst was, in many cases, commercial. Norse rulers who traded regularly with Christian kingdoms, who depended on access to Christian markets, who wanted the diplomatic relationships with Christian rulers that required at minimum the appearance of shared religious identity, found practical reasons to adopt the new faith. Baptism was not only a spiritual act in this context, it was a commercial credential, a business card, a signal to Christian trading partners that you were someone they could deal with, someone who operated within the framework of Christian law and Christian social norms. The famous story of King Canute, the Danish king who ruled England from 1016 to 1035, who is remembered for the probably apocryphal story of commanding the tide not to come in, is the story of a Viking ruler who had fully integrated into the Christian political culture of Europe while maintaining the military and commercial capabilities of the Norse tradition. Canute was not a Viking in the popular sense. He was a medieval Christian king, and he governed England as such, using the administrative structures he inherited, maintaining the church as the institutional framework of governance, corresponding with the Pope and with the great rulers of continental Europe as an equal. The Norse tradition did not simply disappear when Christianity came. It went underground, partially. It was preserved in the sagas and the Eddas, written down by Christian Icelanders who understood they were recording something that was passing but wanted to preserve it. The old myths survived, transformed into the literary tradition rather than the living religious practice. And some of it survived more directly. The Norse calendar, with its seasonal festivals tied to the agricultural year and the movement of the sun, and was partially absorbed into the Christian liturgical calendar. The midwinter festival became Christmas. The spring festival became Easter in some traditions. The old sacred times persisted wearing new names. The Old Norse language itself survived the transition to Christianity, though it eventually diverged into the modern Scandinavian languages. The days of the week in English still carry the names of Norse gods. Tuesday is Tyr's Day. Wednesday is Odin's Day. Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is Frigg's or Freya's Day. Every time an English speaker mentions what day of the week it is, they are invoking the Norse pantheon. The gods are gone. Their names are still there. The legacy of the Norse world extends far beyond Scandinavia and far beyond the Viking Age. Place names across the British Isles preserve the Norse presence in the landscape in a way that no subsequent development has erased. In northern England, the Old Danelaw, the Norse, by ending, meaning farm or settlement, appears in hundreds of town names: Grimsby, Derby, Whitby, Selby. The Thorpe ending, meaning secondary settlement: Scunthorpe, Cleethorpes. The Thwaite ending, meaning cleared land: Braithwaite, Stonethwaite. In Scotland and the islands, Norse place names are ubiquitous. Orkney and Shetland were Norse-speaking communities until the 15th century, when they were transferred to Scottish sovereignty, and the landscape still speaks Old Norse. Hoy, Rusi, Sanday, Ide, all Norse names for Norse-settled islands. In Ireland, the cities of Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, Cork and Wexford were all founded or substantially developed by Norse settlers. Dublin, Dyflin in Norse, Dublin in Irish, meaning the Black Pool, was a Norse trading city for 2 centuries before it became the capital of medieval Ireland. The legal legacy of the Norse world is less visible but equally real. The concept of trial by jury and the principle that the guilt or innocence of an accused person should be determined by a group of peers rather than by a single judge or authority has Norse roots. The Norse thing, with its collective deliberation and its reliance on the community's judgment, fed into the legal traditions of England and Scotland in ways that shaped the development of common law. The DNA legacy is measurable. Recent genetic research has demonstrated the extent of Norse ancestry across the North Atlantic world. In Iceland, virtually the entire population is descended from Norse settlers and the Irish and Scottish women who accompanied them. In the Orkney and Shetland Islands, Norse genetic ancestry is dominant. In the east coast of England, significant Norse ancestry persists in the population more than 1,000 years after the last Norse raid. The Norse people did not disappear. they became part of the people who came after them. It is winter in Scandinavia. Outside, the temperature is well below zero. The darkness began in the middle of the afternoon and will not lift until mid-morning tomorrow. The wind is moving through the birch trees at the edge of the clearing, making the dry branches creak and click against each other. Inside the longhouse, the fire burns. It has burned all day, tended through the morning by the woman of the household, kept alive through the afternoon while the work of spinning and weaving and mending occupied the platforms along the walls, built up now for the evening, its heat filling the single large room with warmth that you can feel against your face. The family is gathered, the farmer and his wife, their children, ranging from a toddler asleep on a fur near the fire to a teenager who is helping the older woman with a piece of leather work, an elderly relative whose age has earned them a place close to the warmth, perhaps a farmhand or two sharing the warmth and the meal that the household provides. They eat. The food is simple, the porridge made from the stored grain, the dried fish, the preserved butter, but it is enough. The stores are holding. The winter is not yet at its most severe. After the meal, someone begins to speak. A story. One of the old stories, the kind that everyone has heard before but that people do not tire of, the way that certain music does not tire you even when you have heard it many times, because the pleasure is not in the surprise but in the shape, in the recognition of something known. There was a man named Gunnar of Lidarendi. He was the greatest warrior in Iceland, and this is what happened to him. The fire moves. The smoke rises toward the roof and out into the winter sky where the stars are beginning to appear through the breaking cloud. The story continues. Outside, the Scandinavian night is enormous and cold and beautiful. Inside, the fire keeps burning. This is what the Vikings were, in the long hours between the raids and the voyages. In the far greater portion of their lives that was not adventure, but simply life. They were people around a fire, telling stories, keeping the cold out, keeping each other warm. Rest now, the fire is still burning. The same fire that burned in the longhouses of Norway and Iceland and Denmark 1,000 years ago. The same warmth, the same stories. Good night.